Hello and welcome back to another Thoughts on Extended Doctor Who media. We've got to find a better name for this. Last time I talked about the podcast Into the TARDIS. If you're not familiar with it, if you didn't see the previous video, Into the TARDIS is a podcast in which they release various Big Finish audio dramas for free, presented by Colin Baker and with the behind the scenes interviews which are also on the CDs. I highly recommend it to anyone who is in the least bit interested in further Doctor Who media. Today we will be talking about the first volume of the First Doctor Adventures because the lovely people at Big Finish decided to do a rarity and actually give us both of the stories back to back on the podcast. Usually it's just kind of like random selections from here and there. Now I want to mention as well, I've very recently finished the William Hartnell run of classic Doctor Who. I have seen everything that is available on BBC iPlayer and a couple of stories that aren't, including the very beginning one and one of the ones that since got taken down for some reason or another. So I am familiar with this classic era and I am fond of it. In much the same way that I'm fond of Star Trek the original series. I don't think it's like the best telly out there or whatever, but it's quaint and it's lovely. And I was excited to see that David Bradley is starring here as the First Doctor. In fact, you could argue that it's his first appearance as the First Doctor because previously he had only played William Hartnell in An Adventure in Space and Time, or William Hartnell playing the First Doctor. This is his first appearance as David Bradley as the First Doctor, if that makes any goddamn sense to you. Am I splitting hairs? Absolutely, but we don't have to worry about that. This was before Twice Upon a Time aired as well. Now, if you watched my previous video about the stories which have aired on Into the TARDIS, you'll know that I gave them 3 out of 5s and 4 out of 5s. I didn't regret listening to any of them, I enjoyed all of them, but none of them really blew my socks off. Although the more I think about Primord, the more I think actually maybe I should have rated it slightly higher, I don't know. And you know, maybe the fact that I wasn't familiar with most of those eras contributed to a slightly lower rating, I guess, because I'm giving the Destination Wars a 5 out of 5. It's fantastic. And I should mention as well, we are talking full spoilers this time. Previously we were not, but now that I am examining these stories in more detail in their own videos, I will be going into full spoilers. So this is your final warning. We will be exploring every aspect of this story. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to it right now. It's free and then you can come back here. How about that? So yeah, it's not just David Bradley returning, it's the entire cast of An Adventure in Space and Time. The guy who played William Russell is now playing Ian Chesterton, so on and so forth. Now, whereas I mentioned that the Third Doctor Adventures kind of got the voices of everyone right, at least to my untrained ear who hasn't really sat down to watch those episodes yet, I will say that the voices for Ian, Barbara, and Susan are a little different, also for First Doctor as well. I guess I'm just more familiar with David Bradley as the First Doctor, so it didn't stand out to me as much. But I would say Ian specifically is very different. That being said, it doesn't really matter all that much, it turns out, because they got the cadence of how they talk right, and after a few minutes I just wasn't thinking about it. It was just fine. I mean, there were a few occasions where I got Susan and Barbara's voices mixed up a couple of times just because maybe the cadence wasn't as heavy on that particular line and they didn't quite sound as close to the original characters as I'm used to. But really, that's nitpicking and I don't really have any complaints. They performed admirably and recognisably. And ultimately, it did feel like a reunion for the original TARDIS crew. I legitimately enjoyed having another adventure with this cast of characters. It didn't feel inauthentic in that way. But it's not just revisiting the original TARDIS crew that made this story so great. The plot of the Destination Wars goes kinda hard. And one last reminder that we're talking full spoilers here, even though the frickin' trailer gives it away. But this is a master story. The First Doctor gets to interact with the Master, and I think that's such a gift. I'm yet to meet the Master for the first time in classic Doctor Who, and I will admit I've been thinking a lot about what's it gonna be like when we first meet him. How's he going to be depicted, because I've only seen John Sim onwards in terms of that character. And I know he's a bit more of like a flamboyant moustache twirling villain back in the day. But it was really cool to see the reveal happen that the inventor is the Master and him and the Doctor know each other from childhood, as they should. And it was so cool to see how the First Doctor might react to the Master. And I like that he's just grumpily approaching his laboratory by going, "What is that scoundrel doing here?" It felt very authentic. Again, there's that word, authentic. It's also fun because we get to play with the idea of Time Lords and stuff. I think what's so great about this story is it retrofits a lot of the lore that gets established later in the show back into the First Doctor's era. But it does it in a way that doesn't feel clumsy or antithetical to the era itself. It allows Barbara and Ian to be like, what do you mean he's of your people? Who are you? And then, of course, he just dances around that. And we also get some elements as well that just don't really get introduced until later in the show's life, such as playing with some elements of time travel, like, for instance, the Master's laboratory is in this kind of time bubble thing where he can speed up time for himself to manipulate this civilization into doing what he wants. And how, at the end of a story, the Doctor ends up taking a 2-year sabbatical to help this civilization grow. Which I just feel like isn't the kind of storytelling that we would get back in the day. At the same time, like I said, it doesn't feel antithetical to the First Doctor's era. We still have moments where the First Doctor is grouchy or grumpy or isn't inherently about to do the right thing. Like Susan talks him down from basically taking up the Master's position of the inventor and using these people to help him achieve his own ends in escaping this place, just like the Master did, except with less warfare. The one thing I will say that surprises me a little bit about this story is, you get a sense, because of the way it's presented on Into the TARDIS, of like the behind the scenes stuff, because they provide these interviews and stuff, and you get to see the impetus behind why they wrote this story, what it was like for the actors, what they brought to it, and I think that's a boon for anyone listening to these. And they talk about how this is like the very first incarnation of the Master that they wanted to explore. And I feel like it wasn't treated with as much reverence as I expected. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. But we didn't hear about them choosing an actor. We didn't hear about like them considering the Master's character from this nascent time in his story, or how he might be different to his future counterparts. Like, I'm sure these are things that were considered, but like, I don't know, just the fact that it wasn't talked about in any of the behind the scenes material, or at least any of the material that was presented to us in Into the TARDIS, it does make it feel a little bit like, oh, he's just kind of there. He almost feels a little generic, and maybe this is just because he's not presented as mentally unstably as he is in future incarnations. But this iteration of a Master, he was fun, but like, he's definitely my least favourite Master. He felt like the most generic Master. He was still a little mustache twirly, he still had this evil plan, he was still an egotist, and he was still fun. But he didn't feel like an S-tier villain like he does in every other incarnation I've seen of him. And that's no disrespect to the actor, I think it was part of a script. I think he's kind of meant to be a little bit more ordinary at this stage in his life, or at least ordinary by the Master's standards. And again, I've not run into the Master in Classic Who yet, so maybe this is more true to a classic Master, so I apologise. And I do believe this is meant to be like a first incarnation before we ever meet the Master, who would not be the very first incarnation. I don't know. Nobody talked about this being the original Master, so apologies if I got any of the lore wrong. Anyway, I am now going to listen to The Great White Hurricane, which aired on Into the TARDIS in the weeks immediately after this, and is also the very next story in this first volume of the First Doctor's adventures. So I will be right back. I mean, for you. For me, I've got to take the long way round, and it's quite late, so I'll listen to it another day, but for you, right now. Okay, I am back. I have listened to The Great White Hurricane, and I'm going to have less to say about this story than the previous one. The Doctor and friends find themselves on the streets of New York, where this time it's not the Doctor who gets shot, it's Ian. And by this time, I mean that's something that's going to happen in the Doctor's future, timey-wimey. Anyway, they end up being separated, because of course they do, and it's a story that focuses on the gangs of New York at the time having kind of a feud for kind of personal relationships that affect those gangs. And then also there's, I think, a really well written, at least from an outsider's point of view, I wouldn't know personally, but a really well written domestic violence subplot where they come across this character called Rosalita who's looking for her son. But it all seems very domestic, and that's because it's true to form as one of the old First Doctor historical stories where they didn't include aliens. It was just meant to be an educational kind of episode, and so this was meant to teach us about the Great White Hurricane, which is an event which transpired that I didn't know about in the late 1800s, I believe it was, where this giant snowstorm blanketed New York City and hundreds of people lost their lives. And so yeah, this story kind of takes place set against the backdrop of all of that, and I won't lie, I think I'm just not a big fan of the whole, like, pure historical stories in Doctor Who, because I don't know, they just come off a little dull sometimes. Like, I really loved the Destination Wars before this. It felt like a really strong Doctor Who story. Maybe some of that was fan service because they were including the Master and stuff, but just the story itself felt really cool as well, with what they were doing with, like, advancing time and watching the civilization change and trying to, like, manipulate it to work for the Master and that kind of thing. And in comparison, this just felt, a little too grounded. The stakes were a little too low, even though the stakes were high, because obviously they were constantly in peril of losing their lives to this hurricane, and also, Ian recovering from getting shot and Susan being kidnapped by this gang member. But ultimately it did take me back to some of those First Doctor stories which I struggled to get through, and is the reason why it took me so long to get through the First Doctor's era here on the channel. It was just fine. 3 out of 5, I guess. It was alright. It was nice to spend more time with his TARDIS crew once more, and I did like the touch at the end, where Barbara saw a hand sticking out of the snow, and she was worried it was the Doctor's, because at the end of the story there wasn't really any death, and I feel like it was important to just kind of drive home, like, yeah, this event still happened, and people did still die, and it was still tragic. But yeah, anyway, that's going to do it for this kind of double episode of my thoughts on this Big Finish adventure, I guess. Gonna try and do more of these as time goes on, probably more individualistic. It's just because that these two were on the same CD and they were kind of grouped together on a Spotify on the podcast, so it felt right to do it because it felt like a kind of a double bill. There was a cliffhanger in the middle there. So thank you very much for tuning in. Let me know what you thought down below if you like, and I will catch you in whatever I make next.